Lenin's goal was to create a communist utopia. Gulags, famine, religion. Education. The October Revolution is considered the most violent communist movement of the 20th century worldwide. It was the precursor for the international rise in communism and all the countless catastrophes that followed. Today, we'll go back in time and take a look at the history leading up to communism's inception. But it wouldn't be Edge of Wonder if we didn't tie it all together to the Illuma donkey. Episode 4, The Russian Red Revolution.
Welcome to Edge of Wonder with our 4th episode on the dark history of communism.
Well, and we've got quite the episode for you today. Leading up to now, we've showed you exactly what communism is, where it came from, what secret forces have been behind it, and we've also attempted to clear up a lot of misunderstandings about just what socialism is.
Today we're going to talk to you about one of the worst examples when communism gets implemented, Russia. We'll share with you stats and facts and even the strategies of how it all works.
We'll also share with you some of the necessary history leading up to communism's inception and try to hit on some of the strange occurrences that you probably won't hear anywhere else. So, without further ado,
much like during the French Revolution, it was a time of turmoil for Russia at the start of the 20th century. Russia and Japan were at war, which severely impacted every aspect of life for the Russian people.
Many people started to demand reform over their discontent of Russia's political system, and in 1905, more than 110,000 workers in St. Petersburg, the Russian capital at the time, went on strike.
They soon formed a peaceful demonstration led by Father George Gapon to appeal to Tsar Nicholas II for improved working conditions and other complaints and desired reforms.
What happened next was known in history as the first, or one of the first, Bloody Sundays. There were others called Bloody Sunday in Ireland, but this was before that. What took place was the chief of the security of police, who also happened to be Tsar Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Vladimir, gave the order to his troops to fire upon the demonstrators.
More than 200 protesters were killed and over 500 were injured from the attack. Revolt is also known as the 1905 Revolution. Nicholas wasn't in St. Petersburg when this happened, however, but everyone blamed him and definitely lost faith in his leadership because of this.
So for those of you that don't know, there was a shadowy figure influencing the royal family at the time. His name was Rasputin, and many historians suspect that he was secretly destroying the royal family through manipulation, deceit, and corruption, and maybe even black magic. You can imagine this dude kinda like Grima Wormtongue from Lord of the Rings, and how they portrayed him in Anastasia was, you know, the Broadway musical, not really accurate.
There are many articles out there that call him the devil in disguise.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the guy. I mean, this photo says more than 1,000 words.
He claimed to be a holy man, and in a set of strange circumstances due to hemophilia, stepped in to stop Nicholas's son from bleeding out. Because of this, he became very close with Nicholas and the royal family.
There are some stories out there claiming he schemed the circumstances revolved around the boy's sickness in order to become closer to the royal family. Unfortunately, we didn't see much evidence to support this other than speculations based off of his reputation.
Now, Rasputin was part of a secret cult called Kleist, which believed that to feel the full grace of God, one would take part in sexual exhaustion that would turn into these massive orgies. They would also flog themselves with a whip to pay back their sins.
Right. I mean, man, this is sounding more and more like the Aleister Crowley of Russia. Anyway, why are we bringing him up? Because he pretty much single-handedly paved the way for Lenin to start his Red Revolution to bring communism to Russia. Hefty claim, but keep listening.
We don't know for sure if this was his plan all along, But there wasn't a single positive thing he did aside from opposing the war that just broke out at this point in 1914. Germany declared war on Russia. Following the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand and his wife, which began the start of World War I.
Right, in 1916, Vladimir Pershkovich, who was known for his anti-communist views, made a speech at the Duma, which is the Russian Legislative Assembly, in which he said that the Tsar and his ministers were puppets on a string, with Rasputin being the puppeteer. Pershkovich and some other nobles basically plotted in secret to kill Rasputin.
Pershkovich, along with other nobles, invited Rasputin to the palace. They proceeded to attempt to poison him with cakes. Because, I mean, really, who doesn't like cakes?
I'd eat them. The men were pretty surprised when Rasputin seemed impervious to the cakes. When they ran out of patience waiting for Rasputin to keel over, one of the men said, "Ah, screw it," and shot him right in the chest.
Yeah, I don't know if they use that exact phrase, but you guys get the idea.
Telling a story here.
But get this, instead of dying, Rasputin leapt up like a wild ranging gorilla and went straight after the guy who shot him in a violent fury.
Well, apparently the magic Lucky Charms that Rasputin must have eaten that morning finally wore off, and when the fight continued outside, it finally concluded by Pershkovich shooting Rasputin in the head, and that ends the life and the times of the wild gorilla magician that was Rasputin.
But this effect had already had a huge impact, and unfortunately, instead of things getting better for Russia, it only got worse.
Yeah, the Russian army lost all faith in Nicholas, and the military leaders agreed to support the Duma if it took control over the country from the Tsar. And let's conclude this part with an important question. Why is it that every point in this series we've come across shady men involved in these occult practices, and they always seem to be paving the way for communism?
But let's get into the rest of this massive story. It wouldn't be right if we didn't backtrack for a moment and talk about one of the most devious individuals in recent history, Vladimir Lenin.
Lenin was born in 1870 and was exceptional in school. He finished first in his class and was a very diligent reader. After his father died of a brain hemorrhage, Lenin started to become troubled, and when his brother was arrested and executed for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III, it sent him over the edge. You know, psychopathic family stuff.
Lenin vowed to get revenge over his brother and soon started to join protests over government orders to ban student societies. He was expelled from his university and exiled.
Lenin soon started to become fascinated by radical extremist works. Once he read Karl Marx's Das Kapital, it basically consumed his thoughts so much that by 1892, he declared himself a Marxist. He then joined the Marxist group called the Social Democrats. I've heard that term somewhere before. Oh wait, that's what some people active in politics in the US call themselves. If you didn't see our last episode on socialism, we highly recommend you to do that.
Influenced by all of these things, in 1895, Lenin went to St. Petersburg with the goal to start a revolution. However, he was arrested and charged with sedition and was exiled to Siberia for 3 years.
Coming back to 1914, World War I just broke out and Lenin went into exile once again. But before he left, he already started his Bolsheviks to prepare for a massive revolution, with Joseph Stalin being third in command after Grigory Zinoviev.
Around this time, the European workers' movement established itself, taking root in communism ideology and using slogans such as "liberate humanity" and "abolish social classes."
The European workers' movement established itself rapidly based on Lenin's ideology. Lenin even said,
"The services rendered by Marx and Engels to the working class may be expressed in a few words. Thus, they taught the working class to know itself and be conscious of itself, and they substituted science for dreams."
People shouldn't be allowed to think outside of their controlled commie thinking, apparently, so dreams were out.
By now, there were already close to 30 global socialist organizations and countless more trade unions and cooperatives. It also had more than 10 million union members and more than 7 million cooperative members total.
Historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote in his book on How to Change the World, Reflections on Marx and Marxism,
"In these European countries, virtually all social thought, whether or not politically motivated, like the socialist movement or labor movement, are visibly influenced by Marx."
So why are we bringing up Lenin? He was a Marxist, and his strategy based off of Marx revolved around revolution.
Lenin knew that to maintain power and eventually destroy classes and every kind of thing civilization had to offer, he had to keep the revolution going by any means. Lenin said,
"A lie told enough becomes the truth."
Revolution is a word that keeps getting passed around in this series. Lenin's role was to solidify these concepts and push them through lies and deceit, forced agitation.
He also saw the importance of educating children and maintaining control. He said,
"Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. Give me just 1 generation of youth, and I'll transform the whole world."
And his revolutions did lead to something. They led to Stalin eventually taking over, but we'll be getting to that soon.
Now, coming back to 1917, things couldn't have gotten any worse for Russia. Hundreds of thousands of people were on strike, food shortages was a major issue, poor living conditions, and Russia's economy was badly hit due to participation in the war.
Millions of people started to protest, and Nicholas II ordered his troops to stop the protesters and keep them off the streets. Over 40 people were killed, which only enraged the people even more.
Over 65,000 soldiers were sent to deal with the protesters by force, but they started to feel sorry for them, and instead of killing them, they ended up sympathizing with them and joined in on the protest.
A few of the Bolsheviks' leaders were arrested and Lenin escaped again. So you might be wondering how Lenin came back to Russia.
Well, what is interesting is that in 2007, the German magazine Der Spiegel revealed a secret that was kept for over 90 years.
It said that while Kaiser Wilhelm II, who regarded Russia as a grave threat, realized that Lenin could bring disaster to Germany. So he allowed Lenin to travel through Germany to Sweden, then Finland, and eventually back to Russia.
William II also provided money and munitions to Lenin and had received 2.6 million marks from Germany. So Lenin secretly traveled in a sealed train and soon arrived back in St. Petersburg, which by this time was changed to Petrograd.
Winston Churchill had this to say about Germany's role in Lenin's return.
They used the most lethal weapon in Russia. They shipped Lenin back in a tightly sealed truck, as if shipping a type of plague virus to Russia.
Now, we aren't clear on Churchill's role either. However, this is a very wise comment no matter how you look at it. But according to Fritz Springmeier, Churchill was secretly playing on both sides.
Right before the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks were released from prison and Leon Trotsky became the leader of the Petrograd Soviet and established a military revolutionary committee. This is where they called for the Bolshevik Revolution.
By this time, they had over 200,000 members, and by taking advantage of the situation, Lenin led the coup, and the Red Guard stormed around the city and started to occupy buildings.
Lenin declared the Constituent Assembly an enemy of the people and formed the first Soviet government with Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky all placed in charge of each government branch. Soon, Lenin used the Red Army to take complete control of the banks.
The next year, in 1918, Lenin changed the name of the Bolsheviks Party to the Russian Communist Party. Thus, Russia officially became a communist country, followed by a Red Terror that haunted the country for decades to come.
The October Revolution is considered the most violent communist movement throughout the world in the 20th century. It was the precursor for the international rise in communism and all the countless catastrophes that followed, which is why we're mentioning it now.
However, an opposition already started to form by a force known as the White Army, led by Admiral Alexander Kolchak. And Russia became engulfed in a civil war that lasted till about 1922.
Lenin didn't spare anyone who opposed him. He regarded the protesters as a plague and had them slaughtered day or night by his Red Army. The streets were full of blood and the bodies of demonstrators everywhere, and those who lived were all arrested.
In the summer of 1918, Russia was facing a massive food shortage due to the ongoing civil war. Lenin sent Stalin to Tsaritsyn to seize the grain from the Volga Basin, the breadbasket of Russia.
According to the Epoch Times book, How the Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World, Lenin sent a telegram to suppress the uprising, which said,
1. Hang and make sure that the hanging takes place in a full view of the people. No fewer than 100 known landlords, rich men, bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all their grain from them. 4. Designate hostages in accordance with yesterday's telegram. Do it in such a fashion that for hundreds of kilometers around, the people might see, tremble, know, shout.
They were leading the Red Revolution with violence, fear, and destruction. Over 100,000 peasants, farmers, and even local police took part in a battle with the Red Army. But the Soviet regime used chemical weapons combined with fire that burned all across the region, rendering the land a wasteland and killing or capturing most of the Tambov rebellion.
150 years in the making. The ultimate evil specter. Lies, hatred, and struggle. Traditions destroyed. The deep state's cult, communism.
Gulags. To make sure everyone feared the new Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Lenin ordered the establishment of the first concentration camps, the Gulags, which were literally hell on earth.
They were also the horrid inspiration to Hitler's Gestapo death camps and the Chinese Communist Party's 610 office, which are known for its brutal torture, slave labor, and even organ harvesting of living prisoners.
The amount of people imprisoned in the gulags became so monstrous that by the time of Stalin's death, there were over 30,000 individual camps all across the nation. Think about that for a second. 30,000 individual camps. They used them to incarcerate, torture, and slaughter those who refused to obey the new Soviet leadership.
You have to remember that Lenin's goal was to create a communist utopia. And just like the deep state, he looked at everyone else as useless idiots, in which Hitler changed to useless eaters.
Marx was born from the Illuminati, and Lenin was carrying out the plan with the goal to eliminate any of the population who wouldn't go along with this plan.
Also, if you remember from our deep state series, the Illuminati believes that the world has too many people, and that to have this communist utopia, more than 70% of the population needs to be killed off. This was part of Hitler's plan with eugenics.
And it was also a plan in the French Revolution that they ended up trying to carry out in France. This has been there the entire time. It's all about survival of the fittest, and anyone who couldn't be who the communists wanted them to be were considered a threat and needed to be eliminated. And the more public and violent it is, the easier it is to make the others submit out of fear.
But we will talk about this more later in the episode. Now, getting back to the gulags, those in prison were severely malnourished. They would barely even have clothes, even though most of the labor was done in the heart of the Russian winter, and be forced to perform heavy labor for 12 to 16 hours a day.
Entire families would be imprisoned together, and even the elderly were forced to perform the labor work. In fact, every walk of life started to become imprisoned if they opposed the Russian Communist Party.
There were even high-ranking party elites, military commanders, highly educated people such as scientists, professors, and even doctors, to religious believers, and then just down to the regular working class people in all different professions.
In other words, these weren't just peasants and farmers. These were anyone that opposed the new communist regime.
According to the Russian state media RT, over 15 million people were sent to the Gulag system, with over 1.5 million deaths being reported. The Gulag was finally disbanded in 1960. That's a whopping 42 years after Lenin created it. The total death count is unknown.
One of the easiest ways for the communist regimes to kill off a boatload of people is through famines. In the 1930s, Ukraine suffered from a mass genocide starvation known as the Holodomor, which was directly caused by the new Soviet regime.
The Soviet government cut off food supplies to Ukraine and built walls around the border so people couldn't leave to search for food. Most Ukrainians survived on potatoes and stored vegetables, but these were all requisitioned by party authorities.
There are stories of Red Army soldiers taking potatoes from children and stepping on them, forcing them to eat them off the ground covered in dirt and mud.
Most farmers starved to death, and people were so desperate that they resorted to eating the carcasses of dug-up cats, dogs, or livestock, which also perished. Because people had nothing to eat, they started to go so mad with hunger that cannibalism became a common theme.
Some parents were even driven to the point where they even ate their own children. This is what this communist utopia was really doing to people. And Lenin and Stalin both welcomed it. They wanted people to become beasts since their goal was to destroy people's faith in the divine.
Some people started to travel long distances looking for food and died along the way. More than 1 million children became orphans and started to beg for food in the larger cities.
Stalin looked at this as an embarrassment, so to combat it, he ordered his army to kill on sight any child they found begging for food.
It was said that dead bodies were seen all over the streets of the Ukrainian cities. If you can actually believe this, the Ukrainian people hated the communists so much that they even preferred the Nazis over them.
This is because the Nazis would go there just to occupy the area and wanted to use their cities as a base, whereas the communists actually just wanted to destroy everything and people.
Sadly, this sentiment made it easier for the Nazis to occupy these areas.
I mean, how bizarre is this? Local people allowing Nazis in? The ironic part is that there was so much wheat harvested by the Ukrainians that Stalin stole that it was enough to feed all of the people there for 2 years. Instead, it was sold on the foreign markets to build up the Soviet army.
Most of the granaries had so much reserve grains that they had to put barbed wire around it and shoot anyone who got close. Only the farm animals were allowed to be fed because according to the History Place website, they were considered necessary for production.
Now, the History Place site also said an estimated 25,000 people a day were dying. So when word of the famine started to get around the world, Stalin invited the media, celebrities, and officials from all over the world to see that it wasn't true.
Once everyone was there, the Soviets made sure the areas they visited were completely cleaned up so everything seemed very normal on the surface. Even reporter Walter Duranty of the New York Times wrote in his article, "All talk of famine is now ridiculous."
Inside Russia was a different story. Anyone even mentioning the word famine or starvation would be killed or arrested for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, or in other words, what would now be considered fake news.
According to the History Place website, the death toll of the Holodomor alone was close to 7 million, which was over 25% of the Ukrainian population.
Religion was a big barrier for Lenin and Stalin. If they could destroy people's faith in religion, then it would be easy to control them. Also, as we said in our first episode, Marx wasn't actually an atheist. He was a proud Satanist.
One of the scariest things he did was hide the fact that communism literally was born out of Satanism because he believed in God so much that he wanted to get his revenge on him. He also knew the masses would never accept Satanism, and under the guise of atheism, they could accomplish a lot more.
Lenin incorporated this into his own philosophy, which is why he was even worshipped as a god. In The Spectre of Communism, it states,
People don't need to worship the devil, but as long as people no longer believe in gods, the devil can corrupt and occupy the soul and eventually drag people toward hell. That is why communist parties sing, There has never been any savior of the world, nor deities, nor emperors on which to depend. To create humankind's happiness, we must entirely depend on ourselves.
Lenin then used violence, combined with other evil tactics, to force religious believers to abandon their faiths and depart from God. Lenin executed thousands of Orthodox clergy who refused to give up their faith over the atheistic communistic views.
Stalin demanded that the whole country be atheist and declared that when his plan was complete, the last priest would be destroyed.
He also stated that the Soviet Union would become a fertile land for communist atheism.
One would not find a trace of religion any longer.
Over 42,000 priests were tortured to death, and only 100 Orthodox churches were still open to the public in the entire Soviet Union, which were only allowed to stay open because they were controlled by the communists. Over 90% of the churches had been closed or burned down by the communists.
One of Lenin's fellow comrades, Nikolai Bukharin, who joined the Bolsheviks' revolution and soon became a Soviet Union politician, said in his published work titled program of the world revolution,
it will become clear that the real significance of religion is that it is a poison which is still being installed into the people. It will also become clear why the party of the communists is a strong antagonist of religion.
The idea of separating church and state was rooted in communist ideology because the idea was to destroy religion and God. Bukharin called God
a vicious old man
and said,
religion must be fought, if not by violence, at all events by argument. The church must be separated from the state.
One reason was so that children in schools would stop believing in the divine, and another was to bring about their ultimate goal, to slowly dissolve the belief in God and to bring about their one world religion, Satanism.
Even today, many organizations and religious groups have been heavily infiltrated by the deep state communist operatives. The World Council of Churches, or the WCC, which was established in 1948, is one of them.
The goal is to destroy religion from within, and it is working. The WCC was the first international religious organization to accept communist countries as members during the Cold War, and also financial support from these countries.
Right. Kind of reminds me how the Pope accepted Jesus being crucified on a hammer and sickle in Cuba. I mean, what? Give us a break. What is that even saying? That's just terrible.
That's just wrong on so many levels. But we better stop here before we start ranting on that, because I mean, that could be a whole subject.
Oh, we'll go there eventually.
And how the church is connected to the rampant pedophilia and all kinds of stuff, but we'll save that for another episode.
But now, let's get into some bloodlines. Now, how many of you might be wondering whether what happened in Russia has any ties with the deep state or the Illuminati? It was also Stalin who said,
America is like a healthy body, and its resistance is threefold. Its patriotism, its morality, and its spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within.
And this is exactly what the deep state's goal is and what this series is about. How the specter of communism has infiltrated every aspect of our American society. Only in the case of the US, it hasn't been through with violence, but through subversive ways.
But does this go even deeper? You might be wondering who or what is really behind Lenin and Stalin. Fritz Springmeier said in his book Bloodlines of the Illuminati that the Rothschilds ordered Lenin and Trotsky to place MI6, which, by the way, is the British Secret Intelligence Service, operatives in key positions during the Russian Revolution.
He goes on to say that these operatives were being controlled by the satanic elite back in London, England. And since Lenin was able to establish the central bank in Russia, this allowed the Rothschilds to get a foothold for their international banking system.
Now again, this is only what we're finding. We definitely suggest you do your research on your own, but according to Fritz, Max Warburg, a German Jewish banker, funded Lenin and his revolutionaries. Jacob Schiff, an American Jewish banker, gave a known $20 million to Lenin.
And the biggest surprise yet, that J.P. Morgan helped finance the Bolshevik Revolution with Alfred de Rothschild's.
J.P. Morgan's name keeps popping up all around.
Sure does.
Okay.
Also, Fritz mentioned that Stalin was a Freemason who was also secretly a devoted Satanist. He does mention that Stalin was somewhat independent, but basically fulfilled what was expected of him.
Fritz also mentions that Hitler was actually the product of a secret breeding program within the Rothschilds bloodline, who was raised by Ashkenazi Jews. He states that from his birth, they already groomed him for who he was going to be.
It's kind of weird that the word Nazi is in it.
I mean, what gives with that word?
I don't know. Fritz also mentioned that Hitler had illegitimate children with women, in which some believe are alive and very well active in German politics today. But this would all be for a completely different episode, and most of you patriots and aeons out there already know who we are referring to.
Now, what is known for sure, and it's even talked about in the Epoch Times Spectre of Communism, is how the Soviet spies were very active within the American government with the sole purpose to destroy our country from within.
Dr. Fred Schwartz, a pioneer of American anti-communist thought, said in 1961,
Any attempt to judge the influence of communists by their numbers is like trying to determine the validity of the hull of a boat by relating the area of the holes to the area which is sound. One hole can sink the ship. Communism is the theory of the disciplined few controlling and directing the rest. One person in a sensitive position can control and manipulate thousands of others.
This actually led Senator Joseph McCarthy to lead his anti-communist efforts. However, according to Fritz, he was becoming a thorn to the Illuminati side, and the people secretly working for them hid or obscured the facts from the public, which made him look paranoid, and eventually they had him killed.
In the 1990s, the US finally declassified files from the Venona project. These showed that over 300 Soviet spies infiltrated the US and even became high-ranking officials in the Roosevelt administration, who had access to top-secret information and were able to influence important decision-making.
However, according to the specter of communism, this is just the tip of an iceberg. Many of the officials today have been and are still working to bring complete communism to the US. And as we all know, the entire deep state's goal is to unite all nations under one government. And as Ben said earlier, their one religion, Satanism. And they chose communism as their twisted agenda to do this with it.
However, an uprising happened that they never expected. The American people didn't accept their communistic and secret satanic ways. And now we have a president who is actually fighting against this cabal, who has been secretly controlling everything from behind the scenes for more than over 150 years.
They never thought the K to the Hillary would lose. See what I did there? And we the people are now winning this battle. So you guys might be wondering about China, such as how it went from a country full of rich culture and tradition to following the Marxist, communist, and satanic ideology.
Well, in our next episode on the history of communism, we'll get into how Mao became a devout follower of Marx and Lenin, and how the Chinese Cultural Revolution became the worst and most violent revolution to date.
So we hope you are enjoying our series on communism and you find it enlightening. We know it can get very dark, but there is a light at the end of this tunnel.
We believe by everyone sharing these stories of the millions upon millions of people who were killed, it will stop events like this from happening or occurring in the future. Slowly things are changing, and really the evil elements in the deep state are kind of too weak now to ever concoct something like this ever again.
People are waking up and starting to accept the true history of what took place and not the downplayed propaganda of what was told to us in mainstream society.
So with that, there is a hope and light through all of this darkness, and we are all the ones changing the world around us. So please share this series with your friends and families to help them learn of the real truth of socialism and communism and how it's part of the satanic cult.
And with that, we will end with a famous quote from former President Ronald Reagan. How do you tell a communist? Well, it's someone who read Marx and Lenin. And how do you tell an anti-communist? It's someone who understands Marx and Lenin.
Well, we hope you liked this episode on the Russian Revolution. Please hit like and subscribe. And as always, you guys, we'll see you out
on the edge. Zinoviv. Who was raised by Ashkenazi Jews.
I don't know.
Look, isn't that interesting that Nazi is at the end of that word?
That is so weird.
Yeah.
That is so weird. I didn't even notice it when I was writing it.
Okay, can I read that over?